As you may or may not know, in Moorton, we have a tradition regarding the preservation of town history. Often when a member of the community dies, their friends, neighbours or family will donate a small box filled with the relics and remembrances of their time on Earth. These memento boxes are stored at the Moorton Heritage Centre. They take many shapes and forms but are generally around the size of an average shoebox. The tradition has been upheld for centuries, though in the early years only the rich and important people contributed a box. The contents of these tiny time capsules are fascinating for a historian such as myself, as they allow for snapshots in time and give me the chance to piece together parts they may be missing from the overall jigsaw of the town's history. Sometimes, though, the boxes not only contribute to the wider story of the town, but contain a story all of their own, a tiny self-contained narrative about an incident, an occasion, or a life that would otherwise be forgotten. Sometimes those stories are positive, things that the people donating the box had no idea were so significant. Such as the time Gerald Ellis's family donated a box that in one corner had a small leather pouch full of coins that he had collected from around the world during his travels in the Merchant Navy. It was only when I examined each coin individually and took the time to research the ones I was unfamiliar with that we discovered some of them were very significant indeed. In fact, of the 90 coins that Gerald had collected, 46 eventually ended up in museums. Sometimes, though, the stories are less positive and, in fact, become the final and indeed only word on matters that until they were committed to the box were closely guarded secrets. I can't tell you the number of times I have stumbled across diary entries, love letters, or even just handwritten notes containing secrets and confessions that the now departed did not feel comfortable sharing in life. Such was the case with George Middleton's box and his story about Tristain. The majority of the stuff inside George's box was of little interest beyond local record keeping, but at the very bottom of the box, there was a sealed envelope. The sight of such an artifact always filled me with a mix of excitement and dread. The note was addressed to me with instructions that it should not be opened before a date that had expired several years earlier. So I opened it and read George's final missive. It was, in a way, a confession. George had always been a deeply religious man, and at the outset of the letter, he quoted part of the Christian Mass during which the gathered worshippers asked God and the rest of the congregation to forgive them, both for what they have done and what they have failed to do. It was the latter that George was worried about. Whilst he himself had not committed a crime and was guilty of no real wrongdoing, for many decades he had lived with a crippling guilt for not speaking up, for not telling anyone what he had seen and what he suspected to be true.
"I know,"
he writes,
"that I should have told someone, my parents or the school or someone, but I just didn't think they would believe me. In all honesty, it's so long ago that I wonder whether it's true, whether I did really see what I saw."
In 1961, so the story went, George had been a pupil at what was then known as Blessed Mary's Primary School in Moorton when a new boy named Tristain Dean was introduced to the class. Tristain was an anomaly in Moorton in that he was that rarest of things, an outsider. Whilst it was never mentioned by the grown-ups that this boy had suddenly materialised out of nowhere into a community and schoolyard where every other child had known every other since birth, the kids soon got wind of the situation and what was going on with little Tristain. According to the playground chatter, Tristain's parents lived in the city. They had separated earlier that year and were planning to get a divorce, something which in 1961 was still a huge rarity, especially in places like Moorton. Relations between his parents had become so hostile that Tristain had been shipped off to stay with his grandparents in Moorton. What I expected to read was that George befriended Tristain, that maybe he felt sorry for this outsider, flung into a new environment like a fish out of water, but that isn't what it said. After a brief description of Tristain, pointing out just how out of place he looked.
"He was dressed like he had come from a private school. He had his hair all gelled over to one side like a boy trying to look like an adult, and he was wearing shorts and socks with a blazer. I knew straight away he was posh, and that he was also likely to be a target for the bullies."
Whether Tristain did ever fall victim to the playground bullies isn't mentioned, though judging by what came next, it seems unlikely. In the next part of the story, George talks about a walk he took along the old bridle path near Bluebell Woods and a somewhat disconcerting experience he had there.
I was walking along the bridle path. This would have been around 6 o'clock in the evening because the sun was just going down. Now, as a kid, I always found that path a bit creepy, but it was the quickest way to get back, so most times I'd either sprint it to get the journey over with, or I'd try to get there before it started going dark. That day I was walking, but I was still nervous, especially when I started to see the birds. Every 10 or 12 paces there it was, a sparrow, balled up, cold and dead on the floor. It was as if they had been left, deliberately in a trail. On every single one, the eyes were either missing or had imploded. I decided, after looking at the third or fourth one in a row, that I was not going to hang around and took up my usual plan of sprinting through the woods until I came to clearing just before the turnoff. Usually this was a nicer part of the path because there were fewer trees and more light in the evening, plus the meadow opposite would be covered in bluebells in the spring. That day there weren't any bluebells. What there was Tristain, sitting with his back against a tree, looking up at the one or two directly opposite. In those trees, dozens of small birds were flitting and jumping between the branches, presumably getting ready to roost for the night, or at least some were. At the base of the trees, scattered around like fallen pine cones, were the carcasses of at least 20 of these birds. As I watched, more and more fell with a soft, cushioned thump to the floor. One after another they dropped, like 2 ripe apples. Some fluttered slightly when they hit the ground, but most were stone dead before they got there. I wondered if it was some kind of disease. In the years since, I've seen tons of examples where whole flocks of birds seem to fall from the sky for no reason. Sometimes because of bird flu or some other disease, sometimes because of poisoning. The bigger question at that moment, though, was not what was happening to the birds, but what Tristain was doing there, just sitting in the middle of the woods and watching them as they fell. I stopped, perfectly still, and watched him for a moment. It was then that occurred to me he wasn't just watching, he was pointing with what looked like a twig all covered in thorns. In the years since, I've often wondered if it was blackthorn or hawthorn or whatever, but have never been able to remember clearly enough to decide. Whatever it was, he held it lightly in his left hand, like a conductor guiding an orchestra, and every now and again, in absolute silence, he would delicately raise the tip of this branch and swipe downwards with it. As in almost the same instant, a tiny bird lummeted from the tree and landed heavily on the ground. I could not believe what I was seeing. Was he anticipating the falls? Seeing the birds stagger or falter on the branches and lowering his stick when he thought they might fall? Or was he, as it appeared, causing them to fall? I coughed loudly and made my way along the path in front of him. I said hello as if nothing had happened and I'd noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Tristain said hello back, and unfazed by my presence continued his little game. Up went the stick and then tump, another sparrow fell. Why I didn't run or simply walk by without saying a word, I don't know. I suppose part of me was scared that he might point that horrible black stick at me. So instead of walking away, I tried to seem friendly and asked him what he was doing. "Oh, nothing," he said casually with a smile. "I'm just practicing what I did not wait to find out." I never told anyone what I had seen Tristain doing. Not my parents, not the teachers, or even my friends. I remember sitting in class and catching him now and again looking at me. He would stare for a while and then smile this weird, smug little smile, as if to say that he knew that I knew. I didn't say a thing, but I wish that I had, because a week later one of my friends called me and a few others into a huddle to tell us that there was something weird about Tristain. According to his folks, since Tristain moved in, every pet on his grandparents' street had died. 4 dogs, 2 cats and a rabbit, all within the space of a fortnight. One of the neighbours outright accused Tristain of poisoning the poor things, but the vet said there wasn't any poison in the dog system, so the neighbour had to apologise. That would have been bad enough. But a few weeks later, around 2 or 3 days before Tristain went back to stay with his mother and we never saw him again, our teacher, Mrs. Ackright, was taken ill. There had been some kind of freakish problem with her eyes, and though we weren't told much at the time, my parents told me later that she started to bleed from them. She was rushed to the hospital and died later that night. The exact cause was never confirmed. I remember when we as a class were told about Mrs. Arkwright's death, there was a lot of crying and sobbing from her students. Tristain, however, did not cry or even frown. Instead, he just leaned over his desk and continued to push his toy car gently over the surface of the desk, making small engine noises with his mouth as he did. A few days later, Tristain was gone, and I decided that there was no point telling anyone what I'd seen because they wouldn't believe me anyway. Not only that, but Tristain knew where I lived, and if he could do what I thought he could do, then I didn't want him near me, and definitely didn't want him mad at me. So I kept silent right up until today, and I'm sorry for that. Sorry because I knew what I knew, and I just let him go, off to do who knows what in other places. For many years I've wondered what became of him, what he might have been doing in the decades that have passed, and whether in the end, practice does make perfect.
I have looked for records of a Tristain Dean in Moorton and in the surrounding areas. I have found nothing so far. Where he might be and what he might have done, we may never know.